Welcome to another Watercolours with Caroline, the second one in the spring series. Today we're going to be painting shells and a little water bird with water wader sandpiper. The water bird is a photograph by Denise McQuillan from the Facebook group Pre-Reference Photos for Artists. Denise takes some beautiful pictures. I love painting her pictures. The shell pictures, very bad pictures, were taken by me. I have the shells here. I have beautiful moon snail. I have some, I don't even know what these ones are, sort of a clamshell type thing. This one here, and this beautiful little one. Really love this little one. So they're all in the shell picture. So welcome. Get your paints and your paper. If you want to do two, you can, or you can do one or the other, whatever you like. And let's paint our birds and our shells.
Now we're going to do this little exercise of doing a flat wash. So I put some notes on here like manage the bead, tilt the paper, mop up the bottom. And what I mean by tilt the paper is I usually get a roll of tape, or I just use this, something to just tilt it just slightly so that the paint is going to run down the paper. We're going to work on dry paper because getting a nice flat wash is good on dry paper. It makes it much harder to do. So for that reason, you need quite a big brush, a nice soft brush that's going to hold lots of paint and water. This is my number 10 Silver Black Velvet. You can use, let's grab my flat brush. You can use a flat brush as long as it's absorbent. Now, yesterday when some people were doing it, they were using, this is a brush for acrylic painting, this one. They don't hold as much water and they're quite harsh. So they were having trouble because their brush didn't hold enough water and it didn't leave the bead at the bottom. Someone else was using a very harsh brush that didn't hardly hold any water at all. So you need a brush that's going to hold a good amount of water and you can get a nice bead of paint that's wet. The second thing you have to do is you have to mix up a really good mix of paint, and that takes a little bit of time. Now the one I did yesterday, where's it gone? Oh, it's on the back of this one. Okay, I showed two things on this one what not to do. So after I had done the wash, I went back and put a bit more paint here to show people you can't go back. Look what happens when you go back and put a little bit more paint on there. You can't accidentally drip water from your brush onto your wash. These are the things that happen if you disrupt the wash in any way. And other things people had trouble with is when they started, they kind of pushed hard on their brush and got a lot of paint out. And then they lifted up with their brush and then they ran out of paint over here. So they had big blob of paint here, no paint over here. So they learned yesterday they needed to be much gentler with even pressure as they put the paint down. So people learned a lot just by doing this for 5 minutes yesterday. They learned, most of them, that they have to mix more wet paint. I'm going to use, yesterday I used Quinacridone Gold. This is the beautiful, beautiful gold of Quinacridone Gold. It's very, very permanent, staining. It'll give you a nice even wash, but I'm going to do, and many of you might not have that. So I'm going to do raw sienna mixed with burnt sienna today, because that's another alternative, very similar color. So here's what I'm doing. I've got my water pot here. I'm putting water on my palette. I'm getting paint. Putting more water on my palette, getting paint. Now I'm going to grab my burnt sienna. I'm going to mix the two together. Paint on my palette. I don't want it too dark, but about that darkness. More paint on my palette, a bit more water. And see, it takes a while. And your paint, look how this paint runs around. Your paint has to be able to run around like this. It can't be like this paint here that's kind of dry. So I keep making my mix, a bit more paint, maybe a little bit more burnt sienna, a bit more water, A bit more paint. I don't want to run out halfway through my wash. Bit more water, bit more paint. And now I've got that. I want to test it. I don't want to just go ahead and paint without testing. Move my water out the way. So big thick brush, gently, and I'm going to test if that's the right color. And it looks okay to me. I might add a little bit more raw sienna. Always a bit of water as well. Test again. That looks all right to me. Thanks, Mike. Got some tea. Thank you. So here are the 3 different colors that you could use for the background of the shells. Actually 4. Sorry, can't count. This is just raw sienna on its own. You could use that as a background for the shells. This is the raw sienna mixed with the burnt sienna, which I've just done. This is the Quinacridone Gold, which is a gorgeous pure color, very transparent, staining, will make you a very flat, transparent, non-granulating wash. And then you could choose Cerulean Blue for your background to your shells if you wanted. It depends whether you want that really warm look behind the shells or whether you want a very cool look behind the shells. If you just want a very pale raw sienna, that would look lovely. If you want something deeper, you can add a bit of burnt sienna. It's totally up to you.
What would you add with yellow ochre?
Yellow ochre's fine too. Yep, yellow ochre's good. As long as you have plenty of water for your mix. Let me just, I put all my paper down already and lost everything in 2 seconds. Right, here's my paper. And let me get some of my yellow ochre. I have yellow ochre. Let's mix a little bit. Water, yellow ochre. And I'll put that next to what I've just mixed. And if you mix the right amount of water with it, you'll have a lovely wash. The only thing with yellow ochre is it can be kind of thick and opaque if you don't add enough water. So if I add a bit more paint to my mix and put that beside it here, you can see how thick, you may not be able to see how thick it is, but it is quite thick. And you may not get as nice a look if you have the yellow ochre too thick, but if you dilute it down with some water, it will be beautiful and look very, I'll put that beside the Quinacridone Gold, and very, very similar. The yellow ochre is more opaque than the Quinacridone Gold. It's it will dry a little bit lighter than the Quinacridone Gold, and you can lift yellow ochre off. You cannot lift the Quinacridone Gold off. It stains the paper really, really well. And it can be a little bit more granulating, which means you can see the paint granules because it's one of the earth colors. And all of the earth colors like burnt sienna, yellow ochre, raw sienna, they're made from clay. And the particles in them cannot be ground very fine. They're ground extremely fine, but they can't be ground as fine as some of these man-made pigments that they make with chemicals, because the pigment size is minuscule, absolutely minuscule with them, and they get deeper into the paper and they're staining. So you have different properties to the different colors you choose. I like to use the ones you can wash off because they're safer. If you make a mistake, you can take it off. Like yesterday, because I was painting 2 and in quite a hurry with some of them, I was using Quinacridone Gold and I went over the edge of the shell here. Now I'm never going to be able to wash that up. I'm going to have to use my white paint to get that little edge back. But if it had been yellow ochre, I could have washed it off easily. So let's, I've got my paint ready. Let's get my piece of paper and put it where you can see it. I'll even, now if I zoom in so you can see really close, I'll make a mistake, but we'll just have to deal with that. Me and my, right, so I'm gonna, again, the brush has to be loaded with wet paint, which means you get your brush in the paint and you roll it around and you fill that brush up. You can't just dip the tip in to the paint. It has to be really full of paint. And then you're going to start, if you're right-handed, you'll start at the left and you'll go across the page gently so you're not pushing at the start, and you'll go all the way across. Now the bead of paint is going to collect at the bottom if you just tilt your paper up a little bit. I've just got a little sponge underneath mine there. Now when you go back with your next stroke, you do not go over this paint. You don't go over it. You go alongside the bead and you pick up the bead as you go across, and you create a new bead of paint as you come across. Now when you come across the next time, I'm picking up paint all the time. You create a new bead of paint, and all the time I'm going back and getting more paint. And halfway through even, I'll pick a bit more paint up so that I'm a full brush of paint as I go across. See the bead forming at the bottom? You cannot go over what you've just painted if you want a flat wash. Now this one, because it's raw sienna and burnt sienna, will be more granulating, which means it'll have more grains showing than the Quinacridone Gold. I've got to make sure I've always got that bead of paint. And I touch, as I come across, I just touch that bead. Just touch it as I come across. Now what happens when you get to the bottom is you have excess bead, excess paint. So I'm washing my brush nice and clean, and I'm going to get it fairly dry on my towel. And then I'm going to use my thirsty brush, which is fairly dry, to mop up very gently that extra bead of paint. I have to be really gentle. And then I'm going to get a Kleenex, soft Kleenex, and very carefully, so I don't touch any of the paint, I'm going to clean up any wet paint so it doesn't go back into the wash. And then I'm going to lay it flat so that last piece of paint there can lay flat and not come down the page. Now if at any point you go back and paint over this or drop water on this before it's dry, it's fine once it's dry, you will get what happened to mine on the other side. This is what happens if you go back with more paint. This is what happens if you drip water on it accidentally, so you have to be a little bit careful. And once this is dry, completely dry, you're fine. You can paint over it. But as long as it's wet, it has to go somewhere safe where you're not going to drip water on it. And I am the worst for dripping water on things I think are safe. So have a little practice. If you have a little piece of paper, it doesn't matter what shape or size your bit of paper is. Helpful if it is your good paper, because the student grade paper does not go flat like this. It usually has streaks in because it's not absorbent. It's not absorbent like this one. For instance, this is just, it's not cotton, it's pulp paper, cheap pulp paper. I'm going to see if the same thing is going to work with this. Prop it up a little bit with a sponge, get my paint, and you can't stop halfway through and mix more paint. You don't have time. So you have to make sure before you start you have a really, really good amount of wet fluid paint mixed up. I'm going to go a little bit more burnt sienna-y this time, and I'm going to use this cheap pulp paper, and I'm going to see if it is as effective as the cotton. Sometimes it's fine, and sometimes you will struggle with cheaper paper. It depends if it's well made and if it's got a good amount of sizing on. You have to work fairly quickly. I slowed down to show you in more detail, so I'm working at my normal pace now, kind of quick. You need a good absorbent brush. This is not bad, this pulp paper. down to my last one, and then just suck up that bead. I don't have any masking tape on this because it's taped at the edges. It's a block. Now you can see on this pulp paper, you can see the grain of the granulating burnt sienna a little bit more, grains of paint. It will dry probably a little bit more evenly, but I can see the grains. I did put more burnt sienna in, so try it. See, even if I tip them with my brush to try and get them out, I risk damaging my flat wash. Now, why would you need a flat wash? It's not always necessary. But if you really wanted to have a beautiful, beautiful flat sky in your picture, because you're going to have more detail in your water, say that, you know, this was going to be very detailed water, and then you want a beautiful flat sky. This is really good to use for a flat sky, or any background that you want really flat with no brush strokes in. And the other thing is just really good to know how to paint without seeing your brush strokes. If you're going to do the sandpiper, that's going to be the total opposite. We can have brush strokes and watermarks and streaks and all kinds in this, because we're going to use that to kind of form waves and a watercolor look. So it's going to be the total opposite of doing a flat wash where you don't see a single brush stroke anywhere. Now this one's starting to dry, and it may look dry, but if I put wet paint or water on this right now, this would happen, because it's not completely dry. It's not ready for the second layer. It's just what we call damp. And damp is the most dangerous time. Damp is when you get this happening, blooms. If you put wet paint on damp paper, you will get these kinds of blooms, which if you were doing, this is totally dry, I did this yesterday. If this was going to be a mountain range here, let's get some green paint. Suppose this was going to be a mountain range here. You've already got in your bloom here, move this one out the way. So this is what I do. I paint and then I forget that I've got something underneath that I shouldn't be getting any water in. You could follow this pattern you've made with your, or you could do that wet line in green on your background that's not quite dry, and you would get that kind of a line that looks kind of like a tree line. So again, knowing how this works can be useful if you, say, wanted that effect. Supposing I wanted this to be a reflection, I'm going to add a little bit of water, a little bit of blue to this. If I wanted this to be a reflection in the water, I can disguise that horrible mess that I made yesterday by just going over it with a little bit of green. I could maybe say, oh, this is a sunburst over here. We're going to have a sun over here. Got some yellow, and we'll put in some sunburst coming from over here. And lo and behold, you can fix it up. Or if you know how to create it, you can actually create it with your paint if you're brave. So now I've put my dry one on the table, which is always tricky, but it's dry. But now you can see if I put the Quinacridone Gold and the raw sienna and burnt sienna looked very similar when they were wet, but you can see when they dry that the raw sienna and burnt sienna is faded quite a lot. Quinacridone Gold stays very vibrant. It's a very vibrant color. So when you want vibrant, go for the quinacridones. And if you want muted, go with the earth colors, the siennas. And there we go. Right, that's mini lesson. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do two paintings, because I know some people have done the shells before and would like to do something different. And I had thought about doing the sandpiper and I wasn't sure about it, and then I decided we would try it, and I quite liked it when I did it. So I got to get my paints organized here and get all those out the way. I am going to start with the shell background, and then I'm going to, while the background of the shell is drying and soaking in, then I will come along and I will do the sandpiper. Let's just get a little closer there. So the background to the shells is done exactly like we just did the flat wash because it's flat, but this time you've got to kink around the shells unless you've put masking fluid on them. I hate masking fluid, so I didn't. I just kinked around them with my brush. What you've got to remember is you can't paint this side and then this side, because down the center you will have a dry line, or over here you will have a dry line. What you've got to keep going is the bead and the wet paint at all times so that you don't have a dry line anywhere. And that is the hardest part of doing a flat wash, is not letting something dry too much so that you have a line. You could stop here. A line here would be barely noticeable and you can cover it with a shadow. So, but give it a go. Decide what color you want for your background. I am going to do the Quinacridone Gold because I really like how that looks. But like I say, if you don't have it, use either raw sienna or a raw sienna and burnt sienna mix. Or if you want to have something much more muted like this, then use a Cerulean Blue in your background. That's fine too. I'm just going to get a space for my Quinacridone Gold, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to put my water down, get my Quinacridone Gold, and more water. And by the way, it's impossible to buy original Quinacridone Gold anymore unless you found a vintage paint store that had it, and people will pay enormous amounts of money for it. The world has run out of it. It was made by the car manufacturers, and car manufacturers have a lot of money for making paint. Art companies don't. They don't have that kind of budget. So they made it for light, fast, bright colored cars in the 1960s, and then they didn't make any more. And Daniel Smith bought most of the reserves of Quinacridone Gold paint, and then they ran out about 5-6 years ago. And now people mix 2 or 3 different colors to get a similar color. I'm just testing mine here to see if it's the right consistency. It looks okay to me. And I'm going to have to turn mine sideways just because it's going to be very difficult. I'll move my camera a little bit. It'll be very difficult for me to paint up above my arm. I'm going to have to paint towards me to get a good bead going. And I'm not going to tip my paper because I want to get around these shells carefully, and that will make it too hard. So I want to have enough paint on there that I can have a bead sitting there waiting for me while I carefully go around these shells and to the other side. Now I'm going to have to work pretty fast to keep those beads wet enough to come back and pick them up. So I can't slow down while I'm doing this. That's why it's great to practice first. Like I say, once I get to this side, I can stop just about here because that's such a little tiny, oops, you can't see there. I'm going to have to pull back a little bit. This is such a tiny part here that nobody's going to notice if you have a line there. So I've stopped at a point that's fairly easy to stop at, and I've got that part, and I'm going to have to turn it around so that I can paint without smushing with my elbow or my arm or anything. And remember, I stopped over here where it was not so critical, and then I can get these lines in. Oops, and I'm getting dots on here, and I don't want that because this paint stains. I will never get those dots off. I just have to paint over them with dark brown. Always an option. Now I am dipping my brush back in the paint every few brush strokes, and I'm making sure it's always going to be wet enough for me to pick up wet paint as I paint. And I'm having to stop talking and breathe when I do this, otherwise I'm never going to get round here without making a mess. And see, as I came around and picked up that part at the side there, it was still wet because it was just a little tiny corner. And right in the middle of those shells is some places I can paint, but that's okay. Now I have a little bit of extra paint here I need to deal with before I do anything else. And a little bit extra here. I've got thirsty brush. I can just suck a little bit of that up. Don't want too much beading up there and running back. Go along the edge of my tape. On the edge of my tape. Now I don't have to hurry to get to the center. That's okay. I want to make sure all of this around the edge is cleaned up and not going to be a problem. It's still wet here. I can put a little teeny bit of paint in there where it's still wet. And there. And then I'm going to get my smaller brush and go back. I'm going to get my number 2 brush here. That was all done with my number 10 brush. You need quite a big brush to keep the paint on, but my number 2 brush is going to get into this little area in here under the shells. Again, being very, very careful I don't get my wrist in anything. And just in here and in here. To keep dipping in. It's a smaller brush, so it doesn't hold as much paint. I have to keep dipping back. It's all about keeping the same amount of water and paint on your brush at all times so that you never get a streak, you never get dry paint, you never get paint that's got too much pigment in. It's all even. Then I have to make sure I don't touch this at all. Let's zoom in again. Let's make sure all these, now what I do have is a little bit of bleeding under the tape here. Dollar store tape. I'm afraid, cheap out on tape for the lessons. I go through so much of it. Right, so if you're doing the shells, if that's one you want to do, and you've got through your entire background wash, it needs to be set aside to soak in and dry. And when all this, see, it's shiny because it's still wet. If it's still shiny, it's very dangerous. Put it somewhere where you're not going to get any drips on it or touch it accidentally or drop your paintbrush on it or any of the things that I do quite regularly. And put it out of the way and let that paint soak in. And then eventually, after a few minutes, it will go completely flat like this or like this. They don't have any shine, but they are not dry. They are damp. I can see that where this one's not taped at the side, it's lifting up because it's damp. So at that point, they need, when they're flat like this, they need the hairdryer to dry them off ready for the next part. But while we're waiting for that, I'm going to do the little sandpiper one. I'm going to start it anyway. So if people want to do the bird, then they can do that one. Now this is completely the opposite. It doesn't matter if you have lines and streaks and all of that kind of stuff. You can even intentionally put backgrounds in and things like that, because we're going to make it look like water and like watercolor water. And we're going to use Cerulean Blue, we're going to use Cobalt Blue, we're going to use a blue and rose mix to make kind of a violet mix. We're going to use a rose and a cobalt and a raw sienna mix to make a kind of a sandy violet mix. We're going to have a lot of different colors in there. This one I had more sandy colors in than what I did yesterday. You can choose whether you put the wave up here or not. You can choose whether you do it with a hard edge or a soft edge. Now, all of these that I did have been done with a hard edge. That means the paper is dry to get that edge there. I'm going to do half this with a hard edge and half with a soft edge as an experiment to see which actually turns out the best in the end. You need to pick one or the other. But let's mix up some colors for this guy now. We need to have our colors ready for the ocean. So your first one you're going to need the most of is Cerulean Blue. If you don't have Cerulean Blue, maybe use Cobalt mixed with Phthalo Blue or Cobalt Blue. If you don't have some of these colors that I use, just let me know. I'll suggest an alternative. They are the best for what we're doing, but you can usually find an alternative. Right, let's bring my mixing tray over. And first color we need is Cerulean Blue. I'm going to put my dirty gold water over there. Clean water. I always put my water down first. A couple of big brushfuls of water. That makes sure that you're not going to have dry paint that's not going to work. I've got gold all over my cerulean. Let's clean that little guy up. Right, so I'm going to get some cerulean and make a nice cerulean puddle here. Literally has to be a puddle. You have to be able to move this puddle around. It has to move. If it's dry like this, you can't really paint with it. We can, but it's not going to work out that great for you, and you're going to run out of paint halfway through. So I got some cerulean there. I also want some cobalt, nice soft cobalt blue. If you don't have cobalt, use ultramarine with lots of water. I got some cobalt there, ready to go. Now I want to mix some violets and some grays. So I'm going to start with the cobalt here for a soft violet, and I'm going to add my favorite Quinacridone Rose. Not just my favorite, in just about every mixing kit for people these days, beginner kit, Quinacridone Rose is the cool red that they add because it mixes with everything to make beautiful colors. Making just a violet, a little bit, see, this is the cobalt blue without the rose, and this is the cobalt blue with the rose, just a nice violet color. Here I've got a bit of a mess. I can get rid of that. Just put a bit of water on it. I'm going to put my gray here. Let's clean that up a little bit. I have a bright red there. Get that out. The bright red will help the gray, but we'll get it out for now. So this one I'm going to mix a gray using, again, the cobalt blue and the raw sienna. Actually, you know what? I dipped in the wrong blue there. The cobalt blue and the raw sienna make a lovely ocean grey-green. Actually, I might just leave that one and add a different grey with a bit of the rose in it as well. You want a variety. What you want is a variety for this ocean colors. Is the cobalt blue with the rose, with the Quinacridone Rose, and then a little bit of the raw sienna to make a more grey, a more violet grey, say. So I'll do it a bit more. The cobalt blue, the Quinacridone Rose, which is very strong, so you only need to like touch it tiny bit with your brush, which makes a violet, and then putting the raw sienna in makes it more grey, but still a warm violet grey. So we've got a lot of colors here using mostly cobalt blue, Quinacridone Rose, raw sienna, and then a little bit of cerulean blue. Now any of these greys can be made with cerulean too. You don't have to limit yourself. I'm limiting the palette, definitely. So I'm going to take a little bit of the cerulean instead, water, and add some rose to the cerulean, which makes, again, a really intense violet because you've got a cool blue instead of a warm blue. So the violet becomes more intense. And then I'm going to add, again, the raw sienna to that. I'll have a slightly different grey. Not that much different, but just slightly different. So I've got that color as well. You can, now when we're doing the ocean, you can switch back and forth between these at will and, you know, create these, all of these subtle ocean colors. But what you need to do is add lots and lots of water to your paint. You don't want to have this paint too thick. There's a second and third layer on here with some more color in. And again, just like the shells, you're going to carefully paint around the dry sandpiper bird. And like I said, for this one, I'm going to try an experiment. On my original ones, I had a dry edge where the waves are. And I wondered the last couple of days, what would happen if I had it wet and did it like the blue sky with clouds. So I'm just going to wet half of that to experiment. Now, if you're going to do this, either do all of it wet or none of it wet. This is me experimenting to see what the look is. I'm also going to wet these bigger areas, but not, I'm going to be very careful not to wet the bird or get too close to the bird, because I don't want to go over the edge of the bird. I'm just going up to the edge of the wave on this side. And we're just going to see what happens. Now I'm going to switch to my number 8 brush. That was my number 10. Wet the brush so that it will accept the water, and grab my piece of test paper. Don't ever do something without testing. And I want to test the dilution. I want to make sure that it's not too strong. I want it to be really nice and subtle. So this, I'm starting with the cerulean, and I'm starting near the breast of the bird so that I have what I want. See, it's dry next to the breast of the bird and wet over here. What I want is a nice sharp edge of white against blue as I come up to the chest of the bird with the point of my brush. Now, the reason I have it wet over here is so that I can just ease that cerulean blue out into the wet without getting lines or streaks or anything too weird. But because I have waves in this ocean, I can also leave some places that are white, because we don't have to have that flat wash that we had for behind the shells. Now, I want to be very careful coming around the beak. I'm doing all the careful areas first. And again, I can't get my arm up and around like this. I have to turn it so that I can easily get the point of my brush down this side of the beak and around the head of the bird. Now, what I'm hoping for is that on the wet side of my waves, I'm going to get an effect like we had with the clouds last week. And I'm not sure how that's going to work, but I'm just going to experiment with that. I'm also going to dip into the Cobalt Blue, slightly different blue. And I'm going to just switch up the blue as I come up to the waves here. Go to Cobalt. I'm going to get a little bit of the violet. And into that wet, I'm just going to experiment, like I said, making those waves like we had the clouds last week. A little bit of the greeny grey. A bit of the greeny grey in here. Wet and wet, a bit of greeny grey. Really doesn't matter what colour you pick up, it just has to be kind of subtle. And then I'm going to turn it around so I can paint the other side without getting my arm in the paint again. I've got to keep shoving stuff around on my desk. Right, so I don't want to switch blues halfway through the bird. That would be odd, but I can continue with the cerulean on this side. And horizontal, if you're painting water, and our focus is all about water, keep your brush strokes horizontal. There's a little tiny bit in here. Put that in. Now I'm going to do some horizontal strokes here, leaving some dry paper. And you have to be fairly subtle. I'm going to switch to the Cobalt. And this area that I wet over here is getting a little bit dry. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to move cameras and everything. There we go. Because I want to get around this bird carefully, so I have to move everything so I can do that. Now a little bit of Cobalt here, and I'm going to come up against this now dry wave as the other side of my experiment. And I'm switching back to the Cerulean, just letting it blend wet and wet with the Cobalt. This is partly like doing the flat wash, but you don't have to be as fussy. I'm going to a little bit of that purpley colour, put the waves in here. See, these are my experiment with the wet and wet waves here, and then this is my experiment with the dry. A little bit of that greeny grey, and put it up here. Let's wash my brush and grab myself a clean Kleenex. And the other thing I can do with these waves is I can take a little bit of that colour off, get kind of a soft edge to that wave. And you don't even have to put the wave in if you don't want to. It was in the photo, and I didn't stick with the colours of the photo, but I did kind of feel in the photo that that wave sort of framed the bird a little bit and suggested the waves coming into the shore. So that's kind of why I left it. But it's not essential, and I think a couple of people didn't bother to put it in yesterday. I'm looking for the photo. Wanted to, where did it go? Here it is. Okay, I have the photo here. I'm going to get a little bit more of that purpley grey. I got a little bit of Kleenex in here. I'm going to do a little bit of wet and wet purpley grey there. Dipping my brush in the water so that I have a mix of colours as I'm coming down here into the closer waves. I have the more purpley grey and then the more greeny grey, just switching between the two. Horizontal strokes. And there's kind of all that white around the legs of the bird. A little bit of the blue, the cobalt blue. And now I'm doing that side to side. Leave a little bit of white showing. Switch colours, switch to a different colour. I'm not going to bother with a lot of the fuss all around the bird. There is, you know, sort of sea foam around him. I'm not going to fuss too much with that. A little bit more of the cerulean. It's all like all coming together, wet and wet. Switch back to a little bit of the green. And of course, some of you may have this one. It depends which one you've chosen, whether you chose the horizontal one or the vertical one. That's up to you, which one you choose. And I'm going to the more pinky grey as it comes up to the shore. Even maybe adding a little bit more raw sienna, because as these waves come up to the shore, like we saw last week, they are then showing you the sand underneath. So I just added a little bit more raw sienna to my grey. I'm going side to side with my brush strokes. And leaving white for the foam and the waves, and we're going to have some dark reflections in these. And I can take my wet brush and I can pull some of these together with a wet brush. Oops, see, I drop my brush on my painting quite often. And I'm going to add wet and wet, a little bit of the cobalt to the sandy color, and there'll be more put in. There'll be more put in later, or lifted off if you wish to lift off later. I'm adding water here and there. It's one time when I'm not worried about water blooms. It kind of looks quite water-like and watercolor-like to have those water blooms. And when this is dry, I can put a little bit more of those streaks in there. I'm going to have to let that dry too. I'm not sure if I'm liking the wet in wet. I don't know, you know, sometimes after it's dry, you can always pick out the edge of the wave with a Kleenex. After it's dry, sometimes it looks a lot better, and you can wash back a lot of these colors. You can lift out, the word I was looking for was lift out a lot of these colors. I want to connect a few more of them here. And again, this has to dry completely before we can go on and do the bird and the rest of the detail. Now I'm going to try and move my camera back where it's more central. I shoved it over to one side there. Yeah, fiddling with everything. There you go. All of these colors fade a bit as they dry, and I think this is probably my most colorful one. Most of them I kept very diluted and subtle. So if yours is more diluted than mine, that's fine. I think I've gone with more color each time I've painted it, getting a little bit more bold with the colors. But what you're aiming for is a lovely, soft, muted mix of colors. And they look much darker before you get the dark colors of the bird in. And then once you get the dark colors of the bird in, then they fade into the background more. So what I'm going to do while you do whatever one you want to do there is I'm going to mute my microphone, put my hairdryer on, and get these two ready for the next step so that they're perfectly dry. Right, mine are dry now. Get some cleaner water. Now the good thing is all of those colors that I mixed for the bird background, they're all going to be used on the shell. That's why these two work well together, because apart from the background color on the shells, all the other colors are very similar. The let's grab my finished shells one here, and I probably have a photo somewhere too. Somewhere I have the shells in a box and I forgot to look for them. So of course the photo's pretty dark, so I lightened everything up just looking at the real shells. But these shells have all of the colors that I just mixed. They have sort of the blues and the lilac-y grays and the raw siennas and the burnt siennas and all those kind of colors in their shading and their shadows. If you look at the lines on this one, it's that kind of a violet color, and then your raw sienna, which of course are complementaries. That lovely violet and the raw sienna are complementaries, and that's what we're going to use, are those complementary colors to help bring these shells out. We've got an orangey yellow in the background, and then if we have these different blues and lilacs, they're complements, so it makes them stand out. The same with the bird. Now the photograph of Denise McQuillan's bird had a very neutral, very neutral grey background, which a photographer can't change. That is the color that the water was, and she's focused on photographing the bird. So she can't affect the background colors. We can, as artists, we can say, well, the bird is brown and sort of raw sienna, so let's go with the complementary colors, which are going to be your lilacs and your cerulean blues, and that's going to make the bird pop out of the picture more. Not going to worry about all of these bubbles in the water. That's a little bit too much to put into a small painting, a lot of detail. if you had a great big painting, it'd be easier. So I've gone with the complementary colors. And once you get all these colors of the bird on there, then all your background colors will fade. So let's start with the shells. Let's zoom in a little bit. So as I said, my background is perfectly dry now. And what I want to put on first is the shadow colors of the shells. I'm going to use Cerulean Blue for some of the shadow colors, and then the Cobalt and the Rose mix for some of the more lilac shadow colors. Raw Sienna, you can see some raw sienna here, burnt sienna, and then a burnt sienna and ultramarine blue mix, and then eventually some deep shadows to really make the shell pop out. So I'm going to start with putting in the shadow colors first, and start with the Cerulean Blue. I'm sort of going to follow my painting. Don't really know what I did with my original photo. It's probably on the computer somewhere. I won't worry about it. And I've got a picture of it there too. So again, bigger brush. I want my number 8 brush. When you're doing a wash or a background, you don't want to be fiddling about with a little tiny brush. And a lot of this shadow can be washed in with a damp brush. So I still have all those colors on my palette, the Cerulean Blue, the Cobalt and Rose mix. Start with the Cerulean Blue, and I want to paint in the direction of the shell and put some of these big shadows on first. So I've put those going in the direction of the lines. I put the Cerulean Blue. Now I've wet my brush, dried my brush a little bit. I have a little sponge here. Dry my brush on so it's not too wet, it's just damp. And I can ease those blue shadows out into the shell, keeping it white in a lot of those places. Dip my brush into some water because I want this blue to be pretty subtle, pretty light. I'm going to do a bit more around here. Wash my brush, dab it off, get it a little bit dry, and soften those shadows in with a damp brush. Now, I wanted my shadow right up to the edge of the gold here. I'd add a little bit more cerulean because I want that cerulean blue against the gold to play off each other, to have that lovely complementary thing that they will do. But I also want to keep a lot of the shell white up here, so I'll leave that. Now I'm going to go into the Cobalt and Rose mix for the shadows under here, further away from the light. And all of these colors can be lifted. So if I lose some white that I want, I could lift it back. I can even lift it off when it's wet. I just put a little bit of water to mix those together, a little bit of a wet brush, get a little bit more paint, a little bit more blue with my mix, tiny bit more blue. I'm going to come around here. It's quite dark under here. A little bit at a time. I'm not rushing because I can see on my painting that I did that I have a little bit of raw sienna there. And again, under here, right down to here, I'm putting the more violet blue mix down here. Slightly damp brush to ease that in. And raw sienna. And just here, wet and wet, And just here, wet and wet. And around here, there's a little bit of raw sienna. Excuse me, I had a little cough there. Be drinking my tea, that might help. And again, with my damp brush, I'm just easing that raw sienna in so that it kind of melds wet and wet. Now, the nice thing with shells and natural things like this is they have a lot of mottled appearance. They have colors here and there and dots of different colors. So it's very hard to go wrong with your dots of paint. Go back to my, I should have gone and looked for the shells, shouldn't I? Really. But if you can see here, what I'm talking about is things like this, where there's kind of a bit more of a hole in the shell here. We're going to put a lot of these lines on later, and to make this shell look rounded, we need more shadow around these areas. So I want my little bit of cerulean, and I have a bit more cerulean around here. And you don't have to worry about the lines and stuff until this is dry. You can put those on later. Now I'm going to switch to my number 4 brush, slightly smaller brush, because I want to mix burnt sienna. Bring it over here. Mix burnt sienna. I'm not going to clean my palette, there's no need. Mix burnt sienna with some ultramarine blue to make a darkish kind of brown, but not too dark, because I don't want to go too dark yet. And put a little bit more dark color coming around here. I'm also going to dip into that violet color. I have the violet color over here, and I've just dipped my brush into it, and I've mixed that brown color with the violet color by doing that, and just changed it up a little bit. And if I feel it's a little bit too dark, I can get my clean thirsty brush and I can just suck a little bit of that paint up and ease it in. Now there will be a lot of extra color put on later, and extra shadow, but this is the base color. This is all of the base shadow on this shell, and then you can move on and you can work on another one. So this one is barely touching this one, so we can work on this one with that. Actually, you know what? No, I won't do this one until third one. Don't want any paint to kind of migrate into another shell. So what we're going to put on the Cerulean Blue shadow on here, and a little bit of the raw sienna shadow, just as a starting point before we put the other colors on. Again, I switch back to my number 8 brush, my bigger brush, so I don't fiddle around with the shadows. Cerulean Blue, bring it over here. Cerulean Blue with a ton of water. We're not talking really strong color here. Let's bring this over again to look at. It's not strong. It's shadow on white. So, and again, I want a little bit of it to come up against the gold, so I have that clay of, and I'm following the lines of the shell. The clay of the complements is what I was going to say, and stopped myself and said something different. But I want the play of the complementary colors, and I also want to follow the lines of the shell with the shading. Get a little bit of the raw sienna. Again, I'm going to bring my raw sienna palette over, and this is what my raw sienna looks like. Incredibly diluted, and put a little bit of that in here. Just mixing wet and wet with the Cerulean Blue, and then the gray, that is the Cobalt Blue and Rose, and then it got a little bit of brown in it, but that's fine, that's just made it a beautiful color. I'm switched to my number 4 brush again. I want to get into these little details and get a bit more shadow down this side with those colors that that violety grey shadow. Then I said I'd work on this one. Now this is the darkest shell of the 5 shells there. So we're going to have a little bit more fun with this one. It's in the foreground. It's the one that catches your eye first. It has quite a lot of dark to it. So what it does have is it has raw sienna up here, and then the ultramarine blue sort of with a bit of burnt sienna here, a little bit of cerulean here maybe, and then the burnt sienna. We can't do it all at once, can't all be put on at once, but we can do it bit by bit and put some on after the first layer is dry. What we want to get first is the raw sienna at the top here. I'm going to add a little bit of burnt sienna to that, just a tiny bit, because I want it to stand out against the background. We will get some shadow around it. There's a bit of a stripe around the shell here, so I'll put that in. Again, the shell is circular, so brush strokes going around in a circular motion. Over here, I did start to mix some ultramarine blue with some burnt sienna. A little bit more burnt sienna. A bit more ultramarine blue. I forgot which part I was doing. I am doing the shadow under here. So I did need to add a bit more blue. I'm going to add a little bit of cobalt to that as well. I'm just grabbing cobalt on my brush now as I come under the shell. I was feeling it was a little bit too grey, so I just grabbed some cobalt on my brush. And you can see I'm going very carefully now, because as I go around these swirls, I want to leave that white line if I can. I'll get a little bit more cobalt by itself. Clean brush, number 4 brush, the cobalt. And I have to watch very carefully what I'm doing, because otherwise I can get lost in this little swirl. And come around here, trying to keep those white lines showing. And then I'm going to switch to raw sienna. Not enough on my brush, a little bit more. Yeah, around here. I'll put the dark center in when this is dry. And let that mix with the blue wet and wet. That's what you want all the time. Just let them mix wet and wet. And then the part that comes around there is more brown, so I will do a second layer, but I put a little bit more burnt sienna with the mix as it comes around here, and leave a little bit of white showing. And around here, and I have a shadow here as well. I need a little bit more burnt sienna with that. I think it's not quite brown enough. I'm using just the tip of my brush so that I can really, really control it. And that's just layer number 1. There will be more to that, but this puts down the base layer of colors that I can work on when these are dry. I don't like what's happened there. I'm going to suck a little bit of that up with my brush. And the side of this one's almost dry, so let's work on this one, because that's not touching. This is pretty dry, not touching anything too much. Same colors. Go back to my number 8 brush, grab my Cerulean Blue, and certainly around this side, under this shell, be in shade. Make sure that this raw sienna is dry. As you come around here, bring these colors around in the shape of the shell and pull them around. Now the other side of the shell is the more violet color, so the Cobalt Blue with the rose. Yeah, let's grab a little bit of water on my brush. And what I do want to get, I'm not going in the direction up this edge because I do want to get this edge nice and sharp, not unevenly painted. But if I make sure that that's left wet, I can come back with my brush and pull from that shadow and pull around in the shape of the shell. Leaving some white highlights to make that shell look rounded. And the very last one is up here, and there's very little shade on this shell. There is the sort of violet. Again, I don't like getting my arm up around my painting, but to save having to switch everything around, I will. So it's quite violet in the shadows here. You know, it looks weird until I get my damp brush and use it to manipulate that paint out and around the shell. And one of the good reasons to have the cerulean on the top shell is so you can have the sort of violet color on the undershell, and then you'll have two different shadow colors. And a tiny little bit of cerulean for the other side. Let's pull that around. Wet brush to just blend it in, and a tiny bit of raw sienna. Little tiny bit on my brush, just in here, and again, just in here. Look, I've got water on my paint. Try not to do that because it does often leave a stain. If it's dry, it's usually okay. Like I drop water here and it's dry, so it should be okay with the Quinacridone Gold. Not so much on the other colors. Like this is the raw sienna. So if I drop water on the raw sienna, as I will do here, because it is liftable, quite often you get a watermark. Well, it's not too bad. It didn't leave too much of a stain, but it will lift a little bit more than the Quinacridone Gold. If you actively want to lift paint from the raw sienna, you can use a stiffish brush. That's not very stiff. Do a little bit of manipulation with the brush and then wipe with the Kleenex, and you can usually lift the raw sienna and the burnt sienna off, but you can't lift the Quinacridone Gold off. It stains, which is nice because if you do drip on it, it's not going to affect it. Anyway, so I've done the under shading on all of the shells now, and that needs to dry before I can go and do the top detail to the shells. I've done the background on the sandpiper, and that needs to dry before I can do the top layer of the sandpiper. So I'm going to leave you for a minute while I turn off my microphone And again, just use my hairdryer so that we can actually get this done today. Right, that's dry enough to work on. And the nice thing is I still don't have to mix any different colors for the bird or the shells, all the same colors from now on. Really workhorse colors, the colors I use. The the raw sienna, the burnt sienna, the cobalt, the ultramarine, the cerulean, they just constantly use them. And the quinacridone rose, I couldn't do anything without those colors, and they're almost always required in student lineups of colors, what they recommend. They just are your workhorse colors. The other ones are fun and, excellent to play with, but you can do almost anything with these colors. So the next thing, going back to the little sandpiper, is to put in, just like the shells, you're going to put in the first colors of his feathers. Let's zoom in on him a little bit here. Denise McQuillan takes such beautiful photos. I wrote to her to make sure that she's fine with me using them for the lessons and everything on the YouTube, and she is. So I've even included a photo with your notes, which I really don't usually do because they do request you don't do that, but it's helpful to you, I think. So underneath these browner feathers, there's sort of raw sienna highlights there. So we're going to put those raw sienna highlights in with little brush strokes. And that gray that I mixed, that sort of lilac-y gray, going to go on the legs, and here at the knees, a little bit of a darker brown here at the knees. I can come in even more so you can see what I'm talking about. You can see this sort of gray color for the legs, and then the more dark brown. We're going to do the gray first, and then when that's dry, put the dark brown on. It's a wading bird. It has quite big wading feet for going through the sand and the surf. So they notice how they come out very wide at the bottom here. And when the first gray is dry, we're going to put these dark colors on here and some of these dark colors in the foam. And there's a little bit of reflection of these legs coming under here, and then some very dark reflections here. We're not going to make it quite this dark, but I'm definitely going to put a few darks in to match the very dark brown of the tail, a very dark brown of the beak, and of course you're going to either use a black pen, you can use a black pen, or you can mix up a nice dark color for the eye. And the second thing we'll do after the raw sienna is kind of dry, we're going to put on these burnt sienna feathers. And, oh, I forgot, just like the shell, a little bit of cerulean blue on the chest. Not a lot. We want it nice and white here, but very, very subtle cerulean blue shadows. Sort of here and a tiny bit here. It's really, really subtle. So let's start with the very subtle cerulean blue. And I'm talking subtle, I'm talking like this. It's like stained water, going back to my number 8 brush so that I don't fiddle. Wetting the brush, getting even more water on there, and gently putting a little bit of shading under the belly here, where the legs are, beside the wing, just coming down the chest, actually quite a bit here, and making sure it's white up here against the blue. So I'm not going to leave that just like that. I'm going to wash my brush, dry it off, and just use my very soft, damp brush to gently ease those brush strokes in. They're very subtle. And I'm going to get my smaller brush, a little bit of the violet color, and just here into that wet blue, and just here into that wet blue, just going to touch a tiny bit of that violet. There's a little bit too much there, but that's okay. Again, thirsty brush, wash it, dry it, use it to just lift a little bit of that off to keep it really, really subtle. I'll zoom out a little bit more. You don't want it that close. So we've got the shadow in just like we have on the shell, and now we need to put the raw sienna on the head and the feathers there. It's an underneath color, because if you just put this dark brown on, you don't kind of have that that subtle color change. It's too severe, white and brown. So what we're going to do is we're going to put on the head, underneath where the dark brown's going to go, we're going to put that kind of golden color, which is the raw sienna or yellow ochre. You know, if that's what you have, it's so similar that you can definitely use that. Down this side here. The back's kind of very light and the head's very light just here, so I'm going to leave that white. And as I come down the bird here, I'm going to put a little bit more raw sienna down the side of the bird. That's just the first layer. And because it's so light, it'll be dry in seconds, and I can come back to it very soon to put in a bit more. There's 3 layers. There's a dark brown and then an even darker brown to the layers. But we can do the legs while that is drying. It'll dry very quickly, like I said. So the legs are the violety grey. So this is the violet that I had for the shells, and I'm going to add a little bit of raw sienna to that until I get that kind of violety grey color. Maybe a little bit more cobalt. And there we go. Look at that grey. Test it. Get used to testing what you've got. That's too dark, so I've got to add a bit of water. Test what you have. That's a little bit lighter. A little bit more water. I don't want it too dark right off the bat. I want to put some of the dark brown over the top. So, tiny brush. This is my number 4. I could even go to a number 2. Let's switch to number 2. Fill it up with some paint and get those legs in. Now, even though they go darker at the bottom, the first layer is going to be your grey, and what I did was I kind of just let the paint pool at the bottom, which will give it a slightly darker look to start with. And then there's the leg behind. Very long stilt-like legs. And come down. And again, just let the paint pool at the bottom of the leg. And here's another thing we need to do when we get down there is there are reflections. So using the same color, the first reflections are sort of in the bubbles here. So you don't need to do strong lines, just some bubbly lines. And you can use this color to do a few over here. And this little brush. And put a few of these little bubbles in. You don't have to put them all in. We're not doing photorealism here. Just going for something that looks sort of similar. Now, as the legs come down in the reflection, they actually get more raw sienna-ish. They get a little bit lighter. So grabbing my raw sienna, and again, I'm not connecting these lines. I'm taking them down from the bird in little lines. I'm going to get a little bit more of that darker grey. I'm going to add a little bit more darker grey to that. It's broken up by bubbles and water. I'm going to get a little bit more darker grey again. And they sort of merge here. And break them up. And then they're going to come into that big dark shadow. Now all around this bird there are shadows. So I have the cobalt blue and the grey on my brush. And I'm going to start doing a few of these little whirlpool type shadows to break up the the water. And get my bigger brush and that lilac colour. And this is just kind of a bit more of some lilac kind of waves coming behind the bird here. Sort of here. Going in with some like bigger waves. And this is how you can add a bit of colour afterwards. Ripples. Your ripples here. All right, now while I've been doing that, I know that this is dry enough that I can go in with the medium brown now to make the bird feathers. So back to our favorite mix, which is your Ultramarine Blue and burnt sienna. Heavy on the burnt sienna because we want a medium brown. Doesn't matter about all this other stuff on my palette. It just adds to the richness of the colors that you're using. Test it. Now I need a little bit more burnt sienna in there. It needs to be a bit more brown. We're going in with the darker ones last, so yeah, that'll do. Little brush, number 2 brush, and I'm going to go backwards from the beak, start here where it's quite dark with those little tiny lines, and using the very point of my brush. Let's zoom in so you can even see better what I'm doing. I'm hoping you can see what I'm doing. Yeah, point of my brush, I'm going up over the bird's head. Now I want to connect some of those feathers on the edge so I have a sharper edge, but at the top of the head here where it's white, I'm going to do less little lines. So darker down by the beak, nice sharp edge, and then less up here. As it comes around, there's white all around the eye, but as it comes around the eye, there's more definition to those feathers. So you see almost a brown line around the white. So, you know, put that in. Don't have it all broken up. And those little... Now, as it comes down the neck here, there's less and less in the way of speckles. It's much lighter, so we're going to come in with darker speckles. Looks much darker on my, I'm looking at my computer screen, it looks much darker up there than on my paper, I have to say. Now what I'll do, so I might come in with darker paint afterwards, but this line from the eye to the beak is quite dark, and I'll probably come and do that darker in a second layer. But I want to get it in there so I don't, you know, it's easy to lose your way sometimes and not know what you've done, and then you accidentally put paint where you shouldn't have paint. So it is helpful to put it in. And also with that paint, I'm going to do a second dark layer on the beak as well, but I'm going to put this color in as the first kind of light. I know it looks dark on my screen, but believe me, once it dries and you put some dark on top, it's going to look lighter. I'm putting that first layer on for the beak, and I can come back and put a little bit more, suck a little bit of the top of the beak up that's in the light, and come back with more later. Same thing for the tail. Tail is very dark, so I'm going to put the tail on. Okay, really carefully. Comes to a nice point, so use the point of your brush and get the tail in there. A couple of the dark spots that the bird has. And then I'm going to add a little bit of raw sienna to that. mix that I have for some of these feathers on the back, because they're not as dark as some of the dark feathers. So I'm just adding a little bit more raw sienna to the mix. And these ones on the chest too, they're quite light. We get this lighter layer in first. Little tiny dots. You can even add, I'm going to add a little bit of rose to that. It's kind of a warm brown. I'm going to warm it up a little bit with a little bit of rose. You may not notice the difference on the screen, but there is a slight difference. I've just added a tiny bit of rose to that brown, so it's not quite so cool. Now again, where the back of the bird is, I want a more solid line so that I have an edge rather than the little speckles of the wings. There's a bit of a white patch here, and then some of the side speckles. And if you're doing the shells, you know, you can work ahead. You can put, if yours are dry, you can use these sorts of colors that I'm actually using to put some details on your shells. I'll come back and work on those. But similar colors to what I'm using here to put speckles and designs and details on your shells. I felt you in the background there waiting, people who are doing shells. You were patiently waiting for me to get back to the shells. I felt I had to say, you know, you can go ahead, you can work on your own for a little bit. Look at your photo, look at my painting and see what you need to do. This is definitely fiddly, this little tiny brush strokes, getting these feathers in and these little dots on the chest. I may have put a few too many. Now I'm going to get the burnt sienna, and I'm going to work on his knobbly knees. I'm going to put a little bit of burnt sienna up here, shading coming down from the body, and then some knobbles on the knees there. And the leg at the back has a shadow going down the back, and you can kind of see the ligament there too. And a bit of shading behind there, and definitely a bit of a shadow down the back of the leg. And like I said, the feet, the wide wading feet at the bottom are quite dark, so I'm going in there with those, and some of those shadows too. I'm going to add a little bit to the reflection rather, not the shadow. And then I lost my thought. I had a thought then, and I completely lost what my thought was. Oh, I know what my thought was. There's some little lines on the legs too, little tiny lines, and put those in just with a teeny tip of my brush. And we're nearly done the bird. Let's pull out a little bit. Now, if you want to put the eye in, it's always nice to have your darks in. You can either use a black pen, or I'm going to get some Payne's grey. Payne's grey is a useful grey to have. Great for mixing some darker colours. I don't ever use black unless I use ink. You can welcome to use ink. And I'm going to mix that with a little bit of Ultramarine Blue maybe. And maybe a little bit of sepia or brown. Just get a nice, not much water. Like, this is the difference between getting a strong color and getting a dark color, is I added almost no water there, just enough to get the paint onto my brush, that's all. And teeny brush, I should maybe switch to a number 1 or 0, but I've got the 2 in my hand. I'm going to be very careful to get that eye in the right shape. I think I just about managed that. There we go, there's the eye. I can use that dark colour I just mixed for the shadow in just a moment. I get a little bit more, I want a darker, this is my burnt sienna and my ultramarine blue, less water because I'm going darker. I want some dark feathers. So now I've got the dark brown. I can go, oops, be careful what I do. A little bit of dark brown under the tail. Bit more dark brown on top of the feathers. Here and there. A little bit more here. And like I said, be careful of the eye. You have to be careful of the eye. A bit more here near the beak. And also, you can kind of see a line here and where the beak is, and the end is pretty dark, so I'm going to darken up the end of the beak there, put a little bit more dark brown on his head, and a bit more on the back maybe, and even a little bit more on the leg. The dark details really you know, really do something for the painting. And I might even put a little bit more dark on his leg there and in these shadows. Now there is in the photo a really dark shadow down here, and I don't want to go too dark, but we have this, I just mixed up this Payne's grey for the eye, my number 6 brush, and I have that dark brown, so I might take a bit of the dark brown, a bit of the Payne's grey, and that might be a little bit of the ultramarine blue, and that might be good, a bit more brown, maybe a bit more burnt sienna. Now that might be good for the shadow, that the reflection rather, that's down here. It's quite a blue grey reflection, so that's why I put some ultramarine blue and some burnt sienna. And then I have my number 6 brush, and I don't want to be too fiddly with this. I want to get it in as you know, as quickly as possible without too much fiddling. Again, horizontal motion of the brush. Don't want to go too dark. There's actually, even in that, a reflection of the legs coming down. And it's a little bit broken up. Now I'm going to go a little bit more blue. I'm going to get a little bit more ultramarine with it, because as it comes out this side, zoom in where you can see what I'm doing. Yes, as the reflection comes out this side, it becomes lighter. It's more blue-gray. It's very dramatic, this little bit of reflection. Now we can't just have that on its own. That's too distracting. That's all you'll see. So with a very small brush, I'll zoom out again, and that color, that dark color, you need to add this into some other places. For instance, there's some bubbles here and rings here. And we can put those sort of with the point of my little number 2 brush. I'm just putting in a few dark ripples, using that mix with a little bit of the ultramarine blue and maybe a little bit more water. And not as many bubbles as you see in the photo. Sort of outlining the bird a little bit, disrupting the reflections. And there are some ripples here. Oh, I've diluted that, the same color, I've diluted it a bit, thin brush, and putting those ripples in. Don't want to do too many, just enough that weird dark reflection isn't too isolated, and they should sort of point towards your bird. So that I'm going to go with the more lilac grey now. I'll grab the more lilac grey and just bring a few in from here so that they point the eye into the picture to the bird. You don't need a lot. And the other thing I did with the other one, go to my number 8 brush, my bigger brush. I've got the lilac on my brush now. What I did do was I put a bit more shadow under the wave. Put the shadow in, wet brush, blend it in a bit, and get a bit more shadow, so I have a bit more shadow here. Oops, in the wrong color there. A bit more here. A little bit more in the way of waves. Don't overdo it. And if you feel like yours is okay and you don't want to add any more, then don't. And be careful as you're adding with the wet brush that you don't go like way over into the bird and start to disrupt the feathers of the bird. So he's pretty much finished. I'm looking at my one from yesterday where I left it, and I don't think those shadows are deep enough, so I might go back and deepen up those shadows a little bit, add what I just added, a few more ripples, a few more around here. Might need a little bit more dark added to this painting from yesterday, just to give it a bit more drama. Not that much, just a little bit, and maybe a touch more. So let's get back to the shells. You shell people have been very, very patient and waiting there, thinking when's she going to get back to us. So let's look at this one. One thing we really, really need is the shadows under the shells so that they're sitting on a surface, not just sort of floating. I always like to use Ultramarine Blue and a touch of burnt sienna for shadows. It's a really good shadow color. So I have a lot of that mixed up already, so I'll add a bit more Ultramarine Blue to that. I may have to go in 2 layers, but let's start with the first layer. I've got my number 6 brush here, and I'm going to go in my number 2 brush into the little tiny ones, little tiny shadows. And the ones that are the darkest, of course, are right in here. So I'm going to go with the darkest ones first. I got Ultramarine Blue, burnt sienna, lots of Ultramarine Blue, a little bit of burnt sienna. Not as much water because I want the paint to be more intense, more dark. I'm going to pop that in there first. And then I can define the edge of this shell more nicely with what I've got there. Pop this one in. Now I have my little tiny number 2 brush at the moment, and I can just come up the edge of this shell just to give it a little bit of an edge. I'm going to switch back to my bigger number 6 brush and I've got a little bit more water on the brush, but not too much because I don't want a big back run. I just want the shadow to be darkest right under the shell. And as it comes away from the shell, it won't be as dark. So I've got 2 brushes in my hand, my number 6 and my number 2. And what I'm doing is I'm using the number 2 to get in those little tiny places. I want to get under these shapes at the edge of the shell. Here. Get a nice, nice sharp edge where it's shaded. the shadow will kind of disappear as it comes along here, so it can get much, much thinner along there. I'm going to take my other brush and just add a little bit more shadow here and thinning it out as it comes back here. It's scary to put the dark shadows in because they're so dark against your white, and you're worried you're going to overdo it. Just don't make them too thick. You know, have water in your brush. And again, not too much water. It's all about just the right amount of water in your brush. I'm going to go back to my little brush and come around this shell. That's why you have to be very precise with your brush. That's why I like these silver black velvet brushes, because they hold a lot of water and they can also be very, very precise. I get that edge in and then just soften that edge a little bit with my bigger brush. Wipe a bit of the paint off on my sponge so there's barely any on there. Shadow edges are often soft. They're hard as they come up against a solid object, and then they kind of diffuse out and become a little bit softer, and quite often have a soft edge, and unless they're in bright sunlight, in which case in bright sunlight they're often very hard edged. So I'm taking this brush that barely has any paint on it, I'm just softening that edge. But because it's still wet, and I can come back if I need to, and I can add a bit more into the dark shadows, and it will soften off into that soft edge. Now again, I'm going to have to tip this around a little bit. Now this one back here doesn't have much of a shadow, but it does need to have a bit of an edge there. And this needs to have a bit of an edge here. Just a little brush and give it an edge. And we're going to put a bit of shadow up against those. Now there's some other really dark places on the shells. I'm going to add a little bit more burnt sienna to my mix. Let's zoom in so you can see what I'm doing. And there's a couple of places where it's quite dark. The center of this shell here, little dark part, and the center of this one here, quite dark. And then that curl that comes around there is fairly dark too, sort of fading out. And now we can start to put in some of the darker details. Now I do want to darken up this edge of the shell and this edge, but I don't want to do that when I have that shadow mix there, because then they're going to blend together and I won't have a sharp edge to my shell. So I have to wait to do those, but I can do things like the patterns on the shells. I want to add a bit of more burnt sienna to my shadow mix so it's more dark brown. Again, my little tiny brush, and I want to put in some of the dark details, like along the edge of this shell here. There are little dark ripples following the kind of the shape of the shell. You don't have to close all the lines up. You can leave spaces between the lines. That's often very pleasing. Like having a connected line is sometimes too much information. People like to have some things to fill in for themselves. A few of these little lines coming down here. For instance, some of these lines coming around here are kind of broken. You don't see them all. And then the lines coming through the shell, they're different colors. I'm going to add a little bit more raw sienna to the burnt sienna so it's not quite so intense, because I want that kind of mid-brown for some of these shadows in the shell coming down here. And shadows like here, it's a little bit, I can even just add, I'm going to grab a bit of just raw sienna Some of them I'm just going to have some like little raw sienna shadows. Back to the mid-brown for some of them, just following my pencil lines. And then some of them I'd like them to just be cobalt blue. I've got some cobalt. I'll switch it up a little bit. Some of the shadows don't have to be all brown. These ones can be, they're more in the light over here. So I'm going to use cobalt blue for those. And even some of these little shadows, maybe a little bit more cobalt down here. Grabbing a little bit of cobalt on my brush. A little bit more shadow down there. Wet brush, blend it in. That one's pretty much done. We don't need to fiddle with them too much. What I like is these ones, they have very distinct patterns on them. I'm going to my much darker brown now. And they have these kind of like zigzaggy patterns on the top.
Welcome to another Watercolours with Caroline, the second one in the spring series.
Which are kind of fun to do.
Today we're going to be painting shells and a little water bird with water wader
my arm up here, which
the
is a little
water
bit
bird
unnatural,
is
but
photographed by Denise McQuillan from the Facebook group
saves moving everything around on my
Photos
desk
for
too
Artists.
much.
Denise takes some
So
beautiful
there's kind of like
pictures.
zigzaggy lines, and then there's lines that come down
the shell pictures,
sort of vertically, and
very
then there's
bad
some
pictures were taken by me.
lines that go
I have
around
the shells
horizontally.
here.
There's quite a bit going on some of these shells.
They all have some, I actually don't even know what these ones are.
And I sometimes
sort of
switch to my more raw sienna mix, because
here,
some of the lines
beautiful little one,
are more
really
raw sienna colour.
So they're all in the shell picture. So welcome.
To my,
get your paints and your
dark
paper.
brown.
If you want to do two, you can, or you can do one or the other, whatever you like.
And again, don't keep your lines broken
and our shells,
because it looks more natural. Back to my raw sienna brown for this. This one's a little bit more light. Break it up a bit more brown here. Have some kind of like little lines on them. And I will be putting a bit more shadow around the shell here too. These ones have those same kind of like zigzaggy lines. They're not regular perfect zigzags, but they kind of sort of make these like upside down V shapes here and there, and then some funny little lines, and then eventually they become just those sort of horizontal bands around the shell. And I'm going to grab the raw sienna because some of them are much lighter. And around here's a few of them. Again, I can always add a little bit more later. The big moon snail has the least in the way of distinct lines, and more in the lilac colors, the lines on this one. So they are more lilac, especially these ones across the top. I've got the cobalt blue with the rose here to put some of these top ones in. And if any of them feel a bit too strong, you can just get your wet brush and soften them in a little bit. A little bit of brown. The ones that kind of come around here a bit more, again, broken up. Some brown in there. And I will put a little bit more shadow. Sometimes switch to your raw sienna, sometimes go to your brown. And I'm just going to look at my photograph, because remember there's these sort of cracks Down here is very dark. So I'm going to use the brown kind of here. And definitely sort of along here. What you don't want to do is you don't want to go too dark. That's going to look too much like you've just painted lines on your shell. It's got to look sort of natural. And take a little bit of the blue. I'm going to put a bit more shadow here. A little bit of the violet and have a bit more shadow here. And here. Again, to try and make it look more round and to have that complement with the violet and the yellow. Wet brush to just soften that in. Oh, the blue here. Yeah. And all we have to work on now is this darker shell here, and maybe come back and put a little bit more on they've definitely got a shadow to go in here. Grab some of the cobalt, and we need to have a shadow. Grab my photograph. I don't know where my photograph actual one that looked like this went. Anyway, I'm putting in a shadow from this shell over the top here so that these lay underneath that one. And then we need a little bit more shading on this one. So definitely some more shading under here. I'm just using the violet, a little bit of blue under there, a little bit of the burnt sienna. I'm going to let them mix wet and wet. Grab my smaller brush. A little bit of the raw sienna coming up here. And going to mix a little tiny bit of burnt sienna and raw sienna together. I got a little bit of shading on this side. That might be a bit too much burnt sienna, might be add a little bit raw sienna, a little bit of water, a bit of water on my brush. And soften that to get that to look rounded. A little bit more blue. I've got a little bit of cobalt blue on my brush. Get that to look rounded. You need to soften it in with a wet brush. Putting the blue on didn't work. It was too watery. Let's put a bit more of the brown on. And tiny brush now. And some burnt sienna for the details around here. Nice dry paper, little tiny brush, a little bit of burnt sienna, a bit of burnt sienna with the blue going around the corner here, just to darken up this and make this more brown around here. Add a bit more around there. I don't like this transition here, it's not very soft. I'm going to try and get a bit more of that water off and lighten that up a little bit. On my original, I had a blue shadow around this side. Maybe add a little bit more of that around here. And try and transition them together with that wet space here. Nice thing is these are all colors that wash off and wash back, so you have a lot more time to manipulate them with a wet brush and with water than the ones that stain. That's why they're so safe. I'm going to take a little bit more of that golden brown and add it around here. This little shell has some lovely colors in it. I kind of want to make it a feature. And this one has a bit more sort of browny color here, so I'll add a bit more brown around there and shading, so that you come to the, you know, the center of that shell. And then you're pretty much almost done your shell painting. Some of it can be touched up later when this is nice and dry, and you look at it and you think, what else do I need to do? Like my one from yesterday. My one from yesterday wasn't finished. I hadn't done all of these little shapes on here. I hadn't done a lot of the extra details. So it's kind of nice to work on a really, really dry piece of paper that's had a day to dry. You can get your colors to go down much more evenly and strongly, and it gives you a bit of time to think about what you're doing and take your time with all the little details as well. You know, there's quite a bit more I could do to this one. Well, I know there's lots more I could do to this one. I haven't done all the shadows and everything, but it's nice to work on dry paper and work at a slower speed sometimes than, you know, we're trying to get it all done in 2 hours, which is a little bit unrealistic. And it doesn't hurt to come back to it at a later date and do a little bit more work on it. Anyway, I'm going to call, you know, I think we got the bird finished. Let's pull right back so you can get my camera way up there. So we got the bird done. We got the shells done, almost finished, not quite, but almost. You know, there's a few things I can see as I look at it. It needs a bit more definition in the darker spots. And I think it's close to finished, just to maybe a little bit more definition in some places. And of course it always looks better. Let's take at least one of the tapes off so we can have a look without the tape interfering with the finished composition. Tape can look so messy. Yeah, so that gives us a better idea. I've got quite a few shell pictures here now. I think I might be making some cards in a little while. I have to say that the first one that I did, that shell, is my favorite. I haven't been able to reproduce that quite the same again. And sometimes things just go right, and sometimes you struggle to get them the same, and it doesn't happen. But anyway, let's end the lesson, and I'll chat to you. I'll stop the recording and see how you all got on.
Well, that was fun. I have to say I really enjoyed painting the bird and the waves behind the bird. Next week we'll be painting a lily, a lotus flower from Thailand. So I hope you join me next week and we can paint some more. Bye for now.